Have you ever stopped and wondered, really wondered, what happens with your data? With your Facebook data, with your ChatGPT data, with your Uber data, or maybe with something as ordinary as your Office 365 data? We all know those companies have enormous power, but I believe I have stumbled upon something of a hidden superpower that we all have. That superpower is very simple. It's our own curiosity. For me, that curiosity started by asking myself, what is happening behind all of those digital interfaces that are put in front of me? That simple question ended up reshaping my own life, and sometimes even reshaping the interfaces that were put in front of me. Now, the very first crack for me was in a Guardian article, an article about a data analytics firm that was working in the 2016 US election. They were working on the Republican side. That company was Cambridge Analytica. That was before the scandal, before people were shocked that a company could build psychological profiles for tens of millions of people. At the time, it was just me and my curiosity. I knew there was something in this story. On one side, there's Facebook. Facebook with its gigantic data collection system, collecting every interaction, every click, every like, every scroll, every post. All of this so they can shape our attention and they can change our perception. On the other side, there were political campaigns who were seeking some form of much more complex influence. It took me a while to understand it, but eventually I focused on a symbol, but a very illuminating symbol of that interaction. That symbol was the red hat. Remember, Make America Great Again? The hat that people would buy so they could show to their neighbors that they were supporting Trump? To all of us offline, that's just merchandise. You can just buy it. But online, it takes a different nature. Every time someone purchases that hat, there's a tiny referral fee going to Facebook. And that fee becomes an incentive to boost content related to Trump. So we had that hat that becomes a data point, that data point that becomes an incentive, and that incentive that ends up reshaping an entire information ecosystem. So as I was thinking about all of that, I met more and more people who were curious about the same topics. And one of them was David Carroll. David is a professor in New York, and he was very interested in Cambridge Analytica. And his curiosity led him to ask a very simple question. What is my psychological profile? So I reached out to him, and I told him about a little detail. That company, Cambridge Analytica, was set up in the UK. And because of that, they were subject to European data protection laws. So David's question actually, in theory, had a very simple answer. He just needed to ask them what his data was. I had suddenly given David's curiosity a legal lever. Now, I already knew at the time, I must admit, that this would be a fantastic story. You have this modern David asking a question to those modern Goliaths of data collection and influence. It was no longer a little slingshot like in the old myth, but it was now a data request. Now, that intuition eventually proved right, because David's story is now told in the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. Now, before the cameras were there, the group grew a little bit, and we were finding all kinds of different things. So I ended up, in March 2018, on this very stage, talking about our findings. And 2 days later, somehow, the scandal really exploded globally. Now, when I say exploded, I really do mean that. Within a week, it was frontline news of the New York Times. Within a month, I had testified at the UK and European Parliament. And by the end of that quarter, Facebook had lost, in a single day, over $100 billion in valuation on the stock market. So for a little moment, it really felt like suddenly the offline world started to understand the online world. But that didn't last at all. Within 2 months, Facebook's stock had completely recovered. There was a public outrage. It did influence public perception, but it didn't really affect market forces. So I started to ask myself a deeper question. Where is data really tied directly to money? Where could my curiosity really start reshaping market forces? And that's how I became interested in Uber. Now, Uber is a really fascinating platform. You just have to listen to Uber's CTO, who said in 2016 that they knew when passengers were desperate for a ride because their battery levels were low. So they could just charge more if they wanted to. But that's on the consumer side. On the driver side, Uber is really powerful as well. Originally, their promise to drivers was be your own boss, work whenever you want. But the everyday reality of drivers now is very different. They complain of arbitrary dismissal. Suddenly, they are disconnected from the platform and they don't know why. They say they are being scored all the time by algorithms they can't understand. They're working longer and longer hours, waiting longer and longer for rides, and all this for lower pay. So their only way to deal with this is to build an entire folklore, a whole set of stories, of myths, of rules of thumb, to try to explain how this algorithm manages their work. I think there's a deeper element here. There's an element of a loss of human agency. They can't understand how they are working. It's beyond economic precarity. It goes into a new form of precarity, algorithmic precarity. So I found all of this very touching, but I also knew that whenever a driver was accepting a ride request, whenever they were picking up a passenger or dropping them off somewhere, this generated new data. So I started approaching the drivers and telling them, look, you could ask for your data. I'll explain it to you afterwards. But this was very difficult. I tried for years going all over Europe, talking to drivers at rest stops, in cafes, gas stations, airport parking lots, all over the place. But they were very, very fearful. They thought they would get disconnected right away if they started standing out. Eventually, I figured out that by telling them the story of David, they could find a role model there. Even though it was a completely different context, they could understand that applied to them. And so progressively, I found drivers who were courageous enough to ask for their data. And with the nonprofit Personal Data IO, we started building dashboards for them to explain all of this data. From scattered data points, they started to see some clarity. They started to better understand how these algorithms, the routing algorithm, the pricing algorithm, were shaping their work. Out of that curiosity started to emerge some form of empowerment. But then the real breakthrough came in 2022, when there was a decision of the Swiss Supreme Court that Uber drivers actually had been employees for all of those years. So that meant that just like any employee in this room, they could claim holiday pay, sick pay, overtime pay, even their car expenses. We're talking about a lot of money for an Uber driver. And this applied retrospectively for many years back. But it came with a real challenge for them, that they needed to be able to document all of this work. And of course, we had the data. So with Drivers in Geneva, we started to build a new form of punch cards. Remember the punch cards of factories in the 19th or 20th century, where people could clock their work hours? Now we had the same, but for digital apps. And so soon enough, there were dozens of drivers in Geneva who had really strong dossiers that they could file with the courts. Soon enough, drivers in France wanted the same thing. So we had hundreds of drivers with really strong cases, but they were still fearful of going to court alone against Uber. So that's when a new type of actor stepped in: litigation financiers. Litigation financiers fund lawsuits with predictable outcomes. That means that they pay the lawyer, they pay the expert, but they take a cut of the winnings at the end. So, right now, there are hundreds of cases in France being financed in this way. Uber drivers sue for free, and the investors take all of the risk. But this is starting to scale up. This month, in November 2025, a new lawsuit, a class action, was announced, representing all drivers in Europe. And this is for their algorithmic pay management. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in claims. The next day, Uber changed their privacy policy. And it's very likely that soon enough, they will have to disclose this to their investors. So we see that this curiosity has transformed into evidence. This evidence has transformed into leverage, and this leverage has transformed into new forms of market pressures. I believe there is a model here, a model where individuals are curious about their data, get together to make sense of it, and then progressively, with the right tools, legal, technical, financial tools, they're able to convert their curiosity into capital. Capital that becomes power, incentives, and ultimately the capacity to reshape entire industries. It's a very powerful form of power. But of course, we all know that there's nothing special here about Meta or Uber. Meta was mapping our attention so they could manipulate us. Uber was mapping offer and demand so they could manipulate the work of many people. But now there are hundreds of AI companies who are starting to try to get us to interact with their systems. They are mapping how we think. Ultimately, they want to map cognition itself. But I don't believe the future needs to belong to those systems. Instead, I believe in human agency and the desire for individuals to understand and observe the world rather than be observed and manipulated. I believe the future belongs to those who are curious. Curious, like David Carroll was, to get a copy of his psychological profile. Curious, like Uber drivers are, to understand how algorithms score their work. Curious, like some of us will be, to understand how AI systems take decisions instead of us, about us. And ultimately, I think the future will belong to those of us who are curious and brave enough to ask a very simple question: what data do you hold about me? Thank you.